You're reading the planet all wrong.
The core is dead. Evacuation is our only option.
No, it's only stalled.
Can you actually restart?
Though the Coalition's greatest minds abandoned Aegis VII, declaring it a graveyard with a frozen core and an atmosphere hemorrhaging into the void, they were wrong. A grease-stained human engineer, gazing at the dying world, saw something different. A stalled engine waiting for a spark. The sky above Aegis VII was bleeding. Without a functioning magnetosphere, the relentless solar wind of its parent star was stripping away the atmosphere, painting the daylight heavens in violent bruised shades of violet and sickly green. The auroras were beautiful, but to anyone with a background in geophysics, they were the glowing tombstone of a dying planet. Inside the monolithic glass and steel spire of the Capitol, the mood was equally funereal. Chancellor Richard Wells stood at the head of the long obsidian table, looking out over the frantic evacuation logistics, playing out on the hololithic projectors. Millions of citizens were being herded onto orbital lifters. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, fear, and defeat. The final models from the Geneva Institute are conclusive, Chancellor Wells announced, his voice echoing off the cavernous walls. The planetary geodynamo has suffered complete thermal collapse. Outer core convection has ceased. In less than 40 days, surface radiation will exceed lethal limits. Evacuation of Sector 4 must be accelerated. A murmur of grim assent rippled through the gathered scientists and military commanders. Aegis VII had been the crown jewel of the outer colonies, a terraformed paradise that took 2 centuries to perfect. Now, due to a catastrophic thermodynamic anomaly deep within its mantle, the planet was shutting down. From the back of the room, a heavy, grease-stained boot rested on a chair. "You're reading the telemetry wrong, Richard." The room went dead silent. Heads turned to find Dr. Thomas Weaver leaning against the mahogany paneling. Weaver didn't look like the rest of the polished academics. He wore a heavy canvas jumpsuit stained with subterranean hydraulic fluid, his face unshaven, eyes red-rimmed from too much caffeine and too little sleep. He was a Terran, a human structural geophysicist, brought in to manage the heavy tectonic mining rigs, not to sit in on high-level planetary council meetings. Dr. Weaver. Wells sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This is an executive emergency session. Your mining operations have already been indefinitely suspended." "I don't care about the mines," Weaver said, walking forward and tossing a battered data pad onto the pristine glass table. "I care about the core. Your Geneva models are built on standard uniformitarian assumptions. They assume the core is a solid mass that slowly cooled over billions of years. But Aegis VII isn't natural. It was jump-started by terraformers. The core isn't dead. It's vapor-locked." Chief Operator David Martin, a stern man with silvering hair, scoffed. "Vapor-locked? Dr. Weaver, this is a planetary body, not a vintage combustion engine. Physics scale, David." "They always scale," Weaver replied, tapping the hololith. The projection shifted from the evacuation routes to a deep scan cross-section of the planet. Look at the thermal gradient at the Gutenberg discontinuity, the boundary between the lower mantle and the outer core. Weaver quickly keyed in a sequence, bringing up a complex string of calculations. If the core were truly dead, the heat transfer equation would show a uniform cooling curve, Weaver explained, his eyes burning with sudden intensity. "We'd expect to see a simple conduction model, governed by Fourier's law. Q igual a K nabla T. But we don't see that," Weaver continued, pacing around the table. "Look at the localized thermal density. The iron-nickel fluid in the outer core hasn't solidified. It has stratified. The lighter isotopes have formed an insulating layer, trapping the heat below it and choking off the convection currents needed to generate the magnetic field. The Navier-Stokes equations governing the fluid dynamics down there haven't flatlined. The Coriolis force is just being suppressed by a boundary layer of stagnant, super-dense silicates." Wells frowned, staring at the numbers. "Even if this wild theory is true, Thomas, it changes nothing. The geodynamo is halted. We have no way to restart planetary scale convection." "Sure we do," Weaver said, a dangerous, reckless grin spreading across his face. "We crack the crust, punch through the MOHO discontinuity, and drop a series of synchronized, high-yield seismic charges directly into the boundary layer. We shatter the stratification. We give the planet a defibrillator shock. The room erupted. "Insanity!" Martin shouted over the din. "You're talking about detonating nuclear devices inside the planet's mantle. You'd trigger global tectonic collapse." "We're already facing planetary death," Weaver fired back, slamming his fist on the table. "You're giving up!" "You're packing your bags and leaving billions of tons of infrastructure and millions of people who won't make it onto those ships to die." My math is sound. Humanity has spent its entire history fixing broken machines by hitting them in exactly the right spot with exactly the right amount of force. This is no different. "Escort Dr. Weaver out," Chancellor Wells ordered coldly, "and lock him out of the mainframes. We have a planet to evacuate. I will not entertain the delusions of a glorified mechanic." Security guards gripped Weaver's arms. He didn't fight them, but as he was dragged toward the doors, he locked eyes with David Martin. "You check the seismic resonance data on fault line 7. Alpha, David," Weaver yelled. "Check the data. It's begging for a spark." The heavy doors slammed shut, leaving the council to their orderly, meticulous surrender. Aegis VII's subterranean district was a labyrinth of dim, sodium-lit tunnels and roaring ventilation fans. It was here, in a grimy dive bar called the Pressure Valve, that Weaver sat nursing a synthetic bourbon. The evacuation sirens wailed incessantly outside, a mournful dirge for the dying world. He wasn't alone. Sitting across from him was Dr. Sarah Jenkins, an astrophysicist whose brilliant career had been derailed by her total lack of respect for authority. She was currently scrolling through Weaver's datapad, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. "You're out of your mind, Thomas," Jenkins muttered, though she didn't look up from the screen. "But is the math wrong?" Weaver asked, taking a sip of his drink. Jenkins sighed, pulling up a secondary holographic display from her wrist comp. The math. The math is actually terrifyingly elegant. If you use shaped thermonuclear charges to create a resonant acoustic wave, a massive directional kinetic pulse, you could theoretically disrupt the silicate boundary layer. The trapped heat from the inner core would rapidly ascend due to sudden density shifts, and convection would restart. She paused, looking at him. "But how do you get the charges deep enough? The deepest boreholes we have are the decommissioned Mk4 tectonic taps, and they stop miles short of the outer core." "We don't drop them down the hole," Weaver said quietly. "We ride them down, in the Hephaestus." Jenkins dropped her wrist comp. "The deep mantle exploration rig?" "Thomas, that prototype was mothballed 3 weeks ago because the ablative shielding couldn't handle the pressure thresholds at the mantle core boundary. If you go down there, the heat will cook you, and the pressure will crush you into a diamond." "I've made modifications," Weaver said, leaning in. "I bypassed the safety limiters, reinforced the tungsten carbide hull with a carbon nanotube weave, and completely rerouted the thermal sinks. But I need a navigation specialist who can read the seismic echoes in real time to avoid magma pockets. I need you, Sarah." Before Jenkins could answer, the door to the bar hissed open. A towering figure silhouetted by the harsh streetlights stepped inside. It was Chief Operator David Martin. Jenkins instinctively reached for a wrench on the table, but Weaver held up a hand. Martin walked over, his face pale, the sharp lines of his uniform contrasting wildly with the gritty surroundings. He stood by the table in silence for a long moment before pulling out a chair and sitting heavily. "I checked the resonance data on fault line 7, Alpha," Martin said, his voice completely devoid of its usual bureaucratic authority. "And?" Weaver asked. "There's a massive buildup of latent kinetic energy beneath the crust," Martin whispered, staring at his hands. "The mantle isn't dead, it's straining, like a dam about to burst. A localized shockwave wouldn't just shatter the boundary layer, it would create a chain reaction. The core would violently cycle. It would work." "But?" Jenkins prompted, sensing the hesitation. "But Wells has ordered all tectonic rigs locked down," Martin said. "He believes your plan is a desperate suicide mission that will only accelerate the planet's destruction. The evacuation fleet can only take 40% of the population, Thomas. The remaining 60%. My daughter is in the Planetary hospital. Her immune system is compromised. She can't survive the hard radiation exposure of a deep space transport." Martin looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I am not leaving her here to die. Weaver nodded slowly. So, we steal the Hephaestus. We steal the Hephaestus, Martin agreed, and the Class V terraforming warheads from the military depot. The heist was orchestrated with the kind of reckless precision humans were infamous for across the coalition. Using Martin's high-level security clearance, they bypassed the automated sentries at the Sector 4 military armory. Weaver and a crew of 4 roughneck human drillers, men who trusted Weaver's instincts more than any politician's mandate, loaded 3 massive, cylindrical thermonuclear devices onto an underground maglev train. By the time Chancellor Wells realized what was happening, the rogue team had already breached the sealed tectonic tap facility. The Hephaestus hung suspended over the gaping black maw of the Mk4 borehole. It was an ugly, brutalist machine, a 60-foot needle of heavily armored plating, bristling with sensory arrays, thermal radiators, and massive plasma drill heads. Alarms blared across the facility as security forces began cutting through the blast doors. "Pre-flight checks!" Weaver yelled over the deafening roar of the facility's klaxons, strapping himself into the pilot's seat. "Ablative shielding at 100%, Jenkins called out from the navigation console, her fingers flying across the haptic keyboards. "Warheads secured in the deployment bay. Synchronization relays are green." "Martin, how long until Wells breaches the main doors?" Weaver asked into the comms. Martin was in the launch control booth above the shaft. "You have exactly 90 seconds, Thomas. I'm locking out the override codes. Once you drop, I can't bring you back up. The winch cables will melt past the crust layer. You have to ride the pressure wave back up when the core ignites." "Understood," Weaver said. He looked at the hololithic gauge. The temperature at their target depth was estimated at $4,500 Kelvin, with pressures exceeding $1.3 times 1011 pascals. It was literally a descent into hell. "May God have mercy on us all," Martin's voice cracked over the comms, dropping the Hephaestus in 3, 2, 1. The massive heavy-duty clamps released. Gravity took hold. The Hephaestus plunged into the abyss. The initial drop was entirely in freefall. For 10 terrifying miles, the Hephaestus plummeted down the pitch-black shaft of the Mk4 borehole, a tungsten needle diving straight into the heart of Aegis VII. Inside the cramped, dimly lit cockpit, the only sounds were the rushing roar of displaced air, the creaking of the heavily armored hull, and the steady, rhythmic ping of the sonar tracking their descent. "Approaching the crust mantle boundary," Jenkins announced, her voice tight but professional. She kept her eyes glued to the seismic monitors, engaging retro thrusters and primary plasma drills. "Brace yourselves!" Weaver gripped the control yoke as the vessel slammed against the dense, semi-solid rock of the upper mantle. The Hephaestus shuddered violently, the G-force pressing them deep into their acceleration couches. Outside the viewport, the darkness was instantly replaced by a blinding, violent orange glow. Rivers of molten rock, pressurized to unimaginable levels, swirled past the thick synthetic diamond windows. The temperature gauges immediately began to spike. External temp, 1,200 K and climbing. "Drills are operating at maximum yield," Weaver shouted over the grinding, deafening noise of the ship tearing through the planet's flesh. "Ablative shielding is holding." "How are we looking on the pathing, Sarah?" "We're entering the asthenosphere," Jenkins replied, swiping through holographic layers of geological strata. "The rock here is plastic. It's moving. We have strong convection currents pushing against the hull. I need you to adjust the pitch to 45 degrees port, or we're going to get caught in an upwelling magma plume." Weaver wrestled with the controls, the hydraulics screaming in protest as he forced the massive vessel to alter its trajectory against the crushing weight of the planet. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his collar. The heat inside the cabin was already becoming oppressive, the life support systems working on overdrive just to keep the air breathable. Depth, 1,500 miles. External temp, 2,800 K. Pressure, 60 gigapascals. "Thomas," Jenkins said, her voice dropping an octave, "I'm reading a massive density anomaly directly below us. It's a localized pocket of supercompressed silicate melt. If we hit it at this speed, the kinetic shockwave will shatter the primary sensor array." "Can we go around it?" Weaver asked, his eyes darting across his own readouts. Negative. It spans the entire diameter of our vector. We have to punch through. Hold on! Weaver gritted his teeth and diverted all auxiliary power to the forward deflector shields and the drill heads. The Hephaestus hit the anomaly. It felt like crashing into a titanium wall at Mach 3. The entire ship bucked wildly, warning sirens screaming as the cabin lights flickered and died, replaced instantly by the harsh, pulsing red of the emergency backups. A shower of sparks rained down from the overhead conduit, and the bitter smell of burnt electrical insulation filled the tight space. "Damage report!" Weaver barked, fighting the yoke to keep them stabilized. Jenkins was coughing, furiously typing on her console. "Hull integrity is down to 82%. We're losing ablative plating on the starboard side, but we're through the anomaly. We are entering the lower mantle, approaching the Gutenberg discontinuity." This was it, the boundary between the mantle and the outer core, the source of the blockage. Arming the warheads, Weaver said, reaching up to flip a series of heavy toggle switches on the ceiling panel, beginning synchronization sequence. He flipped the master switch. A harsh buzz echoed through the cabin. The hololith flashed an angry crimson error code. Error. Warhead 2, sync relay offline. Detonation sequence halted. Weaver's blood ran cold. He tapped the screen frantically. "Sarah, what's happening? Why is the relay offline?" The impact with the silicate pocket, Jenkins analyzed rapidly. It severed the primary fiber optic trunk leading to the deployment bay. The second warhead can't receive the detonation signal from the ship's computer. If we drop them without synchronization, the shockwaves will cancel each other out, Jenkins finished grimly. We won't get the directed kinetic pulse we need. We'll just blow a small crater in the mantle and die in the blast. The core won't restart. Weaver stared at the flashing red error light. They were over 1,800 miles beneath the surface of the planet. The pressure outside would crush a battleship into the size of a suitcase in a fraction of a second. The heat was enough to melt steel instantly. "Is there a manual override on the warhead itself?" Weaver asked, unbuckling his harness. Jenkins looked at him, her eyes wide with horror. "Yes, but the relay box is in the deployment bay vestibule. It's outside the primary life support envelope, Thomas. The ambient temperature in the vestibule is sitting at 180 degrees Celsius. The environmental suit will only protect you for 3 minutes before the coolant boils off and you cook alive." "Then I'd better be fast," Weaver said, moving toward the rear bulkhead locker. "Thomas, it's suicide!" "It's a busted engine, Sarah," Weaver said, pulling the heavy, silver, insulated environmental suit from its rack. "And I'm a mechanic. Keep us steady. When I give the signal, you drop those charges and hit the retro thrusters with everything we've got." Weaver sealed the heavy helmet over his head. The heads-up display booted up, casting a pale blue light across his face. He grabbed a heavy-duty toolkit, gave Jenkins one last nod, and stepped into the airlock leading to the deployment bay. The heavy door sealed shut behind him, locking with a definitive hollow clang. As the inner airlock cycled, the heat hit Weaver like a physical blow. Even through the thermal shielding of the suit, he could feel the terrifying, oppressive weight of the planet's fury pressing in on him. He stepped into the vestibule. The 3 massive terraforming warheads hung, suspended in their launch cradles, vibrating violently with the movement of the ship. Above them, the severed fiber optic cables sparked wildly, the shattered ends dancing in the zero-G environment of the ship's internal dampening field. Suit coolant, 90%. Time remaining, 2 minutes 45 seconds. Weaver pulled himself along the handrails, fighting the violent turbulence of the ship as it ground its way toward the core. He reached the relay junction box above the second warhead and popped the cover using a powered driver. Inside, the circuitry was a complex web of microfiber and plasma relays. "Okay, Weaver," he muttered to himself, his breath loud and ragged in the confines of the helmet. "Just a big, spicy fuse box." Suit coolant, 70%. Internal temperature rising. His hands were shaking. The heat was searing, baking him inside the suit. Sweat pooled in his eyes, stinging sharply, but he couldn't wipe them. He grabbed a set of bypass clamps from his belt and began splicing the severed connection directly into the manual detonation timer. Suit coolant, 40%. Time remaining, 1 minute 10 seconds. Critical warning. External hull temperature nearing maximum threshold. "Sarah, Weaver yelled into the comms. How much further? 2 miles to the drop zone, Jenkins' voice cracked with static. Thomas, you have to get out of there. The vestibule's structural integrity is failing. Almost got it, Weaver grunted, stripping a wire with his thick, insulated gloves and forcing it into the terminal. He clamped it down tightly. The error light on the side of the warhead flashed from red to a steady, glowing green. Sync established, Weaver shouted. Drop them! Drop them now! He threw himself backward toward the airlock just as the deployment bay doors beneath the warheads blew open. The blinding, incandescent fury of the planet's core flooded the vestibule. The 3 massive charges released from their clamps, plummeting directly into the super-dense silicate boundary layer below. Firing retros! Hang on! Jenkins screamed. The Hephaestus violently reverse thrust, the plasma engines screaming as they fought gravity and the immense pressure of the mantle desperately trying to put distance between the ship and the largest thermonuclear detonation in human history. In the airlock, Weaver watched the countdown timer on his HUD tick down. 3, 2, 1. Beneath them, Aegis VII's heart caught fire. The countdown ticked to 0. But in the crushing, hyper-pressurized depths of the lower mantle, there was no sound. Sound required a medium it could reasonably vibrate, and the environment outside the Hephaestus was already strained to its absolute physical limits. Instead of a deafening roar, there was a fundamental displacement of reality. A kinetic hammer of unimaginable power slammed into the silicate boundary layer. The 3 Class V thermonuclear warheads detonated in a perfect, terrifying synchronization. Their shaped charges directed the entirety of their destructive yield downward, creating a localized pressure wave that instantly exceeded $4.5 times 1012 pascals. The blast didn't just break rock. It fundamentally altered the atomic structure of the deep mantle, forcing a violent phase transition in the localized Bridgmanite structures. Inside the airlock, Weaver was thrown violently against the reinforced inner bulkhead. His environmental suit screamed a digital warning as the dampening fields of the ship overloaded. The Hephaestus groaned, the tungsten carbide hull buckling inward under the immense concussive rebound. Thomas! Jenkins' voice tore through his helmet comms, frantic and heavily distorted by the electromagnetic interference of the nuclear blast. The inner airlock door hissed open. Jenkins, bleeding from a jagged gash on her forehead and fighting the erratic gravity fluctuations of the tumbling ship, grabbed the heavy shoulder pauldron of Weaver's suit. With a desperate heave, she hauled him into the primary cockpit. "I've got you!" she yelled, slamming her fist onto the emergency seal button. "The retros are firing at maximum yield! We're riding the thermal column up!" Weaver scrambled out of the boiling environmental suit, gasping for the relatively cooler, filtered air of the cabin. He threw himself into the pilot's seat, his hands flying across the manual controls to stabilize their chaotic ascent. "Show me the telemetry," Weaver coughed, violently wiping sweat and stinging hydraulic fluid from his eyes. Did it work? Did we break the stratification? Jenkins pulled up the deep scan sonar arrays, her fingers dancing over the cracked glass of the haptic interface. The holographic projector flickered, struggling to render the sheer thermodynamic chaos unfolding beneath them. But as the image resolved, Jenkins let out a breathless, shaking gasp. "Mother of God," she whispered, her eyes wide. The data was beautiful. It perfectly mirrored the classic Bullard-Gell-Mann dynamo models pioneered back on Earth, a kinetic theory thought utterly impossible to synthetically replicate on a planetary scale. The impenetrable layer of super-dense silicates that had choked the planet's core had been completely obliterated. Freed from its prison, the immense trapped heat of the inner core was violently expanding upward. "Look at the thermal gradient!" Jenkins pointed a shaking finger at the console. "The lighter iron-nickel isotopes are superheating. They're rising, Thomas!" "We have initiated Rayleigh-Bernard convection." Weaver glanced at the readout. The critical threshold for convection, the Rayleigh number, had spiked dramatically past the point of stability, governed by the thermodynamic mechanics of the fluid core. $Ra equals frac rho g alpha delta TL3 mu kappa $. With the temperature differential dollar, delta T dollar, now violently unrestrained, the iron-nickel fluid was rushing upward to the mantle boundary, cooling and preparing to sink again. The Coriolis forces of the planet's rotation were catching the fluid. The geodynamo was physically turning. System alert. Kinetic shockwave overtaking vessel. Structural failure imminent. The core is breathing again, Weaver said, a fierce, reckless grin breaking through his exhaustion. But it's going to exhale right on top of us. What's our velocity? Ascending at Mach 2.4, but the magma plume behind us is accelerating, Jenkins warned, frantically adjusting the thermal shields. We are surfing a localized tectonic eruption. Weaver checked the ship's vital statistics, and his grin vanished instantly. The reality of their situation was painted in harsh, flashing red lights. We're losing the portside plating, Weaver muttered, his jaw clenched tight. He compensated for the intense drag by firing the starboard lateral thrusters. If that thermal column catches us, it will melt the command deck into slag. Suddenly, the proximity alarms began to scream, a new, high-pitched warning that cut through the roar of the engines. Thomas, Jenkins said, her eyes fixed on the seismic readouts. The shockwave. It didn't just shatter the core boundary. The acoustic resonance echoed up through fault line 7. Alpha. Martin's fault line? The one with the stored kinetic energy? Yes! The blast triggered it. The fault line is unzipping toward the surface. Jenkins rapidly typed on her console, projecting the geological path of the newly forming fissure. All the color drained from her face. Oh no. Oh God, no. What is it, Sarah? The magma plume we just created. It's being channeled into the 7 alpha fissure. It's following the path of least resistance. She looked at him, absolute terror in her eyes. Thomas 7. Alpha terminates directly beneath Sector 4, the evacuation zone. If this magma column reaches the surface, it will vent as a supervolcano right underneath the capital. Millions of people. The orbital lifters. The entire remaining population of Aegis VII, including David Martin's sick daughter, were sitting directly on top of a loaded gun. How long until the plume breaches the crust? Weaver demanded, his voice dropping into a cold, mechanical focus. 12 minutes, Jenkins replied, her voice trembling. We're currently above the primary mass of the plume, riding its pressure wave. But we can't outrun it, and we can't stop it. Yes, we can, Weaver said, gripping the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. We have a 60-foot needle made of depleted uranium, tungsten, and carbon nanotubes. We are a giant metal plug. Thomas, you can't be serious. The Hephaestus won't survive acting as a kinetic diverter. The thermal mass will obliterate us. I didn't say we were going to survive it, Weaver interrupted gently, locking eyes with her. I said we're going to fix it. Reroute all remaining power to the deflector shields and the port thrusters. I'm going to wedge this rig sideways into the narrowest throat of the 7, Alpha fissure. We'll force the magma to branch off into the uninhabited subterranean cavern systems in Sector 9. Jenkins stared at him. She looked at the flashing red warnings on her screen, then at the holographic map showing the liquid fire racing toward millions of innocent people. She thought of the sick children in the Planetary hospital, waiting for transports that were about to be vaporized from below. Jenkins took a deep, shuddering breath, wiping the blood from her face. Rerouting power to lateral thrusters, she said, her voice dropping into a dead calm. Let's plug the drain. On the surface of Aegis VII, the world was ending. Chancellor Richard Wells stood on the tarmac of the Sector 4 spaceport, the deafening roar of the orbital lifters drowning out the wailing sirens. The sky above was a horrifying canvas of irradiated violet. The planet's magnetic field had been completely absent for weeks. But now, the ground was shaking. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic tremors of standard tectonic drift. This was violent, erratic. David Martin ran across the tarmac, clutching a heavy military comm tablet. "Chancellor!" Martin shouted over the din of the engines. "Are the last transports loaded, Martin?" Wells demanded. "We have to launch." "The geologists are reporting a massive seismic event beneath our feet. The planet is cracking." "It's not cracking!" Martin yelled, shoving the tablet into Wells' hands. "Look at the magnetometer readings from the Geneva Institute satellites." Wells looked down. The lines on the graph weren't flatlining anymore. They were surging. "This is impossible," Wells whispered. "The magnetic induction equation is reading a massive influx of kinetic fluid motion at the core," Martin explained furiously. $frac, partial math BF, B partial T equals nabla times math BFU times math BFB plus eta nabla 2 math BFB $. The velocity of the fluid math BFU is multiplying the magnetic field math BFB. Martin pointed at the sky. "The geodynamo is active. Weaver did it." He actually did it. As if on cue, the sickly, bruised violet of the sky began to shift. The deadly solar winds, which had been stripping the atmosphere bare, suddenly met resistance. A shimmering, brilliant blue aurora flared to life across the horizon, the unmistakable, beautiful glow of a functioning magnetosphere deflecting stellar radiation. Cheers erupted from the crowds of evacuees waiting on the tarmac as the sky literally began to heal before their eyes. But Martin wasn't cheering. He was looking at the ground. Sector 4. Subterranean proximity alert. Magma displacement detected. Depth, 10 miles and rising. He restarted the core, Martin muttered in horror. But the shockwave opened the fault line. "It's coming right for us." Deep beneath their feet, the Hephaestus was losing its battle. Weaver had successfully maneuvered the heavy mining rig into the narrowest choke point of the 7 Alpha fissure. He had slammed the vessel sideways, burying the massive plasma drills into the solid bedrock of the cavern walls, wedging them in tight. Below them, the sea of liquid fire arrived. The magma plume hit the underside of the Hephaestus like a freight train. The impact shattered the remaining ablative armor instantly. The temperature inside the cockpit skyrocketed past 120 degrees Celsius. "Hull integrity critical!" Jenkins screamed over the deafening roar of the Earth, tearing itself apart. "The pressure is building! It's trying to push past us!" "Hold together, you ugly piece of junk!" Weaver roared, keeping his hands locked on the thruster controls, forcing the ship to push downward against the rising tide of fire. The physical mass of the Hephaestus, combined with its active deflector shields, created an artificial dam. The superpressurized magma, finding its upward path blocked by the stubborn Terran engineering, violently sought a new exit. Seismic shift detected, the computer blared. Fluid dynamics rerouting to secondary fissures. Trajectory: Sector 9 subterranean caverns. "It's working!" Jenkins cried out. "The flow is diverting! Sector 4 is safe!" "Yeah, well, we're not!" Weaver shouted, as the main console exploded in a shower of sparks. The heat was melting the titanium bulkheads. The ship was dying. "Eject the command pod," Weaver ordered. "We're buried under millions of tons of rock," Jenkins argued. "The pod can't punch through the crust." "We don't need to punch through," Weaver yelled, unbuckling his harness and grabbing her arm. "The magma diversion just blew out the pressure seal on the Sector 9 vents. We ride the steam geyser up." Weaver slammed his fist into the emergency ejection sequence under the console. Warning: manual ejection initiated. Explosive bolts armed. The explosive bolts severed the command pod from the main body of the Hephaestus. Just as the lower half of the rig was instantly vaporized by the sheer thermal mass of the magma plume, the escape pod was shot horizontally through the newly opened steam vent channels. It was a blind, terrifying roller coaster ride through the planet's exhaust pipes. The pod bounced violently against the jagged rock walls, its emergency thrusters firing blindly to keep them centered in the tunnel. Weaver and Jenkins were thrown against their restraints, the G-forces pushing them to the edge of unconsciousness. Up. Up, up, up. With a deafening sonic boom, the escape pod erupted from the surface of Aegis VII, shooting out of a massive steam vent in the desolate, rocky plains of Sector 9. It arced through the newly blue sky, a tiny metal seed spat out by the resurrected world. The pod crashed hard into the volcanic ash, tumbling end over end before finally coming to a halt against a basalt outcropping. Silence fell over the plains, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the distant rumble of the healing Earth. 2 hours later, a coalition search and rescue dropship touched down on the ash plains of Sector 9. David Martin was the first one out of the bay doors. He ran through the thick, settling dust, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw the scarred, blackened husk of the Hephaestus escape pod. Its emergency beacon was flashing a weak, rhythmic red light. "Thomas!" Martin yelled, his voice cracking. "Sarah!" He reached the pod and grabbed the manual release lever for the hatch. It was jammed. Before he could call for the rescue team's heavy cutters, a loud metallic clang echoed from inside the pod. Clang. Clang. With a screech of protesting metal, the heavy hatch was kicked open from the inside. Thick white smoke billowed out into the cool evening air. A heavy, grease-stained boot stepped out onto the ash. Dr. Thomas Weaver emerged, his face smeared with soot, his canvas jumpsuit singed and torn. He coughed violently, leaning against the side of the pod. A moment later, Doctor. Sarah Jenkins climbed out behind him, leaning heavily on Weaver's shoulder. She looked battered, exhausted, and incredibly alive. Martin stopped in his tracks, staring at them in sheer disbelief. He looked from Weaver to the pod and then up at the sky. The auroras were dancing, vibrant, beautiful, and stable. The deadly solar radiation was being repelled. The planet was humming with a deep, resonant vibration that Martin hadn't felt in months. "You did it!" Martin breathed, stepping forward to catch Jenkins as she stumbled. "Thomas, you brought it back to life. The geodynamo is fully active. The evacuation has been halted." Weaver spat a mouthful of soot onto the ground and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked incredibly tired, but a spark of pure, unadulterated human stubbornness danced in his red-rimmed eyes. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavily dented, scorch-marked wrench, and tossed it to Martin. "Told you, David," Weaver rasped, a faint smile breaking through the grime on his face. It wasn't a tomb, just a stalled engine. Weaver looked up at the vibrant, glowing sky of the planet they had just saved, then patted the scorched hull of the escape pod. And the engine's purring. Humanity doesn't just survive the dark universe. We roll up our sleeves, grab a wrench, and fix it. If you loved this deep dive into the rogue engineering that saved Aegis VII, smash that like button and share it with a fellow sci-fi fan. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on more incredible HFY stories every week. Stay curious, stay stubborn, and I will see you in the next one.